Good morning. So, everybody can hear me. I will try to keep this right where it should be and all. First, I have a lot of thanks to give. Thank you, Gordon, for getting me involved in this, and Dick Smith as well, and all the folks at the MOAA chapter, and in particular at the museum. It's been a pleasure to work with you, and I've enjoyed it immensely, and I am very grateful. Second, to the Burke family. I'm sure you lost track. You weren't sure if I was still at this. I haven't seen you in 19 years since the reunion in 2002, but I'm still at it, despite the stubbornness of the United States Navy's and their inability to, in fact, make sure that Burke and other naval heroes are, in fact, honored the way they should be by history. And I am truly delighted that you are all here. This is an updated and modernized and all presentation on the Admiral, and I hope you enjoy it. The other thing I need to note is this. Way back in the early 80s, Adm Burke used to come to the Naval History Symposiums at the Naval Academy. And I gave a paper on post-war naval strategy, the first effort that I had started to do, trying to figure out what the context was for what he had done. It ran long. So what happened when it was over, Burke was in the audience. He came up with his cane because, for those who don't know, he actually had 3 hip replacements. 2, and then a third one kept popping out, so he had another one at the age of 90. So a very hardy individual. And so Adm Burke comes up, and he looks me in the eye, and he says, "Dave, that was very good." He says, "But let me give you a word of advice my pappy used to tell me. When you want to spread manure, don't overload the wagon." I hate to tell you, but as you will note, this is a bit overloaded, but I think you'll enjoy it. So let me get started. Adm Burke is a naval hero. He was a hero in World War II. He was a hero in the Cold War. He made the cover of Time magazine. He made the cover of Collier's. And then in 1982, Secretary of Navy John Lehman, who knew Burke and who was also, like myself, was assisted in getting a commission in the Navy, was aided by Burke, made the decision to name the class of what is now the largest post-war class of U.S. Navy destroyers, the Arleigh Burke class of guided missile destroyers, after the Admiral. And that is USS Arleigh Burke. My friend Rick Easton, who is here, was the commissioning executive officer of Arleigh Burke. And then that is a picture taken in 1994 on the bottom of Lieutenant Commander Rosenberg with the Burkes at the Virginian during one of those visits. This is Arleigh's childhood. The gentleman in the upper left-hand corner is August Bjorkgren, who came to the United States in 1855, recognized that Bjorkgren came from Sweden, and realized that Bjorkgren was not going to be an easy name for people to pronounce, and changed his name to Burke, which is one of the reasons why so many people tend to think that Arleigh was Irish, which of course he was not. He was Swedish. Okay. Gus was a tough guy. He was the first baker in Denver, Colorado. He went into a partnership with George Pullman, who created the Pullman sleeping car company, but not in sleeping cars, so he didn't benefit from all of that. And ultimately, he had 4 sons and a number of daughters, and basically banished his sons to the 4 corners of Colorado so they wouldn't bother him. At least that's been some of the story that has been handed out. Oscar, the strapping young man in the middle, is Arleigh's dad. He was a farmer and a rancher. He met Clara Moakler. You can't make it out, but she had red hair. And Clara came from Illinois, of Dutch ancestry, and had in fact been a teacher, and at least according to Arleigh and family tradition, she may well have spent a year at the University of Illinois. She was a teacher. She believed in education. This was part of both his heritage and a bit of an annoyance to Oscar. Anyway, Arleigh was born October 19, 1901, in that house behind the buckboard with Oscar and infant Arleigh Burke, taken in 1901 or 1902, and that is the original house that was behind the current Burke stone house that is now still in existence with the senior housing community. Burke never lived in the stone house. He lived there, and also in a tent behind it, because with the growth of the family, it turned out that Oscar was worried that with so many girls before brother Bill was born, that it was better. So Arleigh lived in a tent with a floor and a wooden floor and a stove, and worked on the farm, but made the decision that he was going to go to school. I should note, the lower left picture is Arleigh with sister Ruth. These are two very determined people, as you've heard. And I was delighted to meet Ruth and her husband. And I have to tell you, everything was said about Ruth, as well about Arleigh, is absolutely true. Okay, that is Baseline School. This was taken after Burke went there. The buildings to the right are some of the outbuildings from the Burke farm, and then there's a shot of Arleigh that's on the Boulder Historical Society website on his horse as a young man. Arleigh decided very young that he really wanted to move on from Boulder. Oscar didn't like it. Oscar wanted him to inherit the family farm. He was the oldest in the family, and Arleigh, supported by his mother, made the decision that what he wanted to do, and actually it's easier to go back to this just to get the feel of this. This is really worth remembering of how Arleigh Burke got to the Naval Academy. Arleigh went to Boulder Prep, now Boulder High School. He was interested in a military career. World War I was going on, and so forth. And he was thinking of applying to the military academies, to the Naval Academy. The military academy appointments had all been used up. He was still finishing his sophomore year in high school at Boulder Prep. And what transpired was the flu epidemic hit. And of course, given what we've all experienced with COVID, we realize what now, much more so, what something like that was like. They closed all the schools. They closed the university. And so Arleigh got himself a job with his best friend, Paul Rapace, later a medical doctor in Massachusetts, on a threshing crew moving up from northern Colorado into Wyoming. And the two of them were enjoying themselves immensely, making their own money. But what transpired was that they were talking to a roustabout around the campfire one night, and he said, "You guys really don't want to do this." He said, "You'll be just like me. You'll think this is great, but eventually this is how you're going to end up. You don't want to go there." And so what transpired was that Arleigh decided he wanted to make a better life. He came home, decided he wanted to go to Naval Academy. He wrote to his congressman, was told he needed to take a competitive examination, and so he started doing part-time jobs for University of Colorado professors who in fact were not teaching at the time, and they were tutoring him to learn what was necessary. He was supposed to ride into town and take the exam one day in December, when his father, still not supportive of this, said, "You know, looks like snow. Maybe you ought to ride your pony into town and spend the night in a barn." Arleigh did that. The snow became a blizzard. Most of the kids who were going to take the exam didn't show up, and Arleigh scored higher than any of the other ones who were there and won the appointment. Arleigh did not know if he could then pass the entrance exam, so he took the money he got from being a roustabout and from letters that I was able to photocopy from the Burke family, things that he kept on writing home to Mom about getting additional money. He went to a cram school in Columbia, Missouri, run by a former congressman and his wife, that happened to be above a pool hall, separate story. And what happened was he waited tables at fraternity houses. By doing that, he actually learned enough to pass the entrance exam, came home to Boulder, and when he told his dad that where the school was, his dad took him downtown to the pool hall to see if Arleigh, in fact, knew how to play pool, because he wasn't sure he had actually done that. Anyway, so this is great. He's supposed to go to the Naval Academy. He has an appointment, and he's going to get on the train. The flu epidemic is still raging, but Oscar gets sick. Not the flu, smallpox. It's a light case. Arleigh, of course, is not living in the house anyway. Arleigh is quarantined away. They get him on the train. They send him, he goes to Annapolis, he gets off, he takes the physical exam prior to being sworn in, and is told that his albumin level is low. The blood tests bring this back, and the doctor says, "Okay, go home, go back to where you're staying, eat a bunch of bananas and come back tomorrow." He ate a bunch of bananas, the blood levels came in, he was sworn in on June of 1919. Anyway, so I'm not going to spend as much time, but I figure for a Boulder crowd, local local crowd, you really needed the story of this and all. And so the other point I just want to make is Arleigh Burke is one of two chiefs of naval operations, the other one being Chester Nimitz, who never graduated high school. Okay, so Arleigh is a member of the class of 1923. This is the class behind Memorial Hall and Bancroft Hall. I was going to have a little exam to see if anybody wanted to pick Arleigh out, but I don't think that's fair. There he is, strapping young man. There are a number of these shots. He does pretty well for a kid who never graduated high school. He graduated 70th in the class of 412 graduates, 414 in the class, 412 actually survived to graduate. Midshipman Burke, a handsome and strapping young man. Ensign Burke on the right in full dress. This was the Navy full dress uniform in the old days. And that is Arleigh Burke's graduation certificate from the United States Naval Academy. He did not receive a bachelor's degree. Bachelor's degrees were not granted at service academies until 1933. So Burke did not get he could have applied for a bachelor's degree later because they made it retroactive, but he never did. So we don't have a copy of that. But he graduated. And the other thing that he did is on the day he graduated, June 7th, 1923, he married Roberta Gorsuch of Lawrence, Kansas. She had come to Washington with her sisters and her parents during World War I. She worked as a file clerk in the Department of Agriculture. She was a Christian Scientist, as was Burke's early roommate, and she came out to the Naval Academy with her sister, who knew his roommate, and they had a blind date. And Arleigh was smitten. However, one of the fascinating things that we have, this story, the letters that you showed, Mark, show how much Burke wrote. This has been the joy and the bane of my life in terms of understanding how much Arleigh wrote. Well, he wrote over 200 letters to Bobby, and amazingly, she kept them all. So we have those. And the fact of the matter is, Arleigh had a great date with her in the fall, but then because the Regiment of Midshipmen was protesting restrictions on hazing, Burke had gotten a Class A offense because crockery, which they used to use to wash up, was missing from his room, and anyone with crockery missing got a Class A offense. But they were only a few demerits away from being kicked out of the Naval Academy, and the entire regiment was restricted. So he couldn't, in fact, date her until January. We have the letter inviting her to the Naval Academy for a dance, and then we have the next letter in which Arleigh explains every possible term that midshipmen do, 3 or 4 pages, and they kept up this correspondence. He didn't keep hers, but she kept his. And it's just amazing. They married that day. This picture was taken in 1924 when Burke was stationed in San Pedro. This was taken in 1937. Arleigh always said, Bobby said, he always wanted a dog, a Great Dane, that could look him in the eye. And this is one of the 2 Great Danes that they owned. When he was during building the destroyer Craven, this was taken in 48. This is a homecoming when he came back from the deployment of the USS Huntington, taken after World War II in their house up Foxhall Road in Washington, and then finally in mess dress as CNO. This was a wonderful marriage. She was an incredible woman. I would say that Arleigh had the right stuff to start with from what his parents gave him. But Bobby, I would put it this way, he never wanted to do anything that would make Bobby ashamed of it. This was just something he could not do. And she was his conscience in all sorts of little ways. And this was a remarkable marriage. They had no children, but this was a remarkable marriage. They also made a deal. And the deal was that she was devoted to the Christian Science Church and he was devoted to the Navy, and they were the top priorities. And supposedly they would never come between, but the fact was they truly made it an incredible and inspiring marriage. Oops, that turned it off. There we go. First ship was USS Arizona, the battleship. Before she went through the conversion that she looked like when she was bombed at Pearl Harbor. And again, a marvelous shot. There is Arleigh right there. Anyway, the interesting point is he learned a great deal on board Arizona, and among other things, he fell in love with gunnery. He, in fact, ran a turret, took part in various things. This is pushing a peanut with his nose in a competition on the ship. Never fully explained, neither by him. And he made the decision he wanted to become a member of what was known as the Gun Club. Namely, these were the elite folks in the Bureau of Ordnance who, in fact, really ran the Navy. These are the guys who knew how to do, basically put shells on target. And Burke, in fact, fell in love with and spent special time during his 5 years and last few years on Arizona in the initial analog computers the Navy had. So this established a very, very important part of his life to understand the importance of being able to use computers to, in fact, calculate the fall of shot. He then goes on board the USS Procyon, where he is serving as assistant navigator. That is a shot, it's a good picture. That's Arleigh with a beer in Cuba during that time. But he actually applies to the Navy Postgraduate School in Annapolis. He doesn't make it the first time, but is accepted the second time. This is Arleigh at the Navy Postgraduate School, where, remember, he didn't have a bachelor's degree. So the Navy spent time essentially getting him ready so he could go to the University of Michigan to get a Master of Science in Chemical Engineering. The Navy sent 3 officers to that school, separated by a year. The first was Tom Hill, became Nimitz's operations officer. The second one was a guy named John Sides, Savvy Sides, who also became commander of the Pacific Fleet under Burke as CNO. And this is the shot of Burke at his graduation. This meant, however, since the Navy paid for his master's degree, he was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Bureau of Ordnance, and they weren't going to let him forget it. And how he got out from under it is part of the story. So he spends a year on the cruiser Chester running the main battery. He actually learns to fly because a classmate teaches him how to fly using one of the scout planes, but he doesn't have particularly good hand-eye coordination. He is then sent to the base force, let's go back. He is then sent to the base force staff, where he is, in fact, the assistant and then the officer in charge of the fleet camera party. Great shot on the bow of a cruiser. Public affairs, right? No. This is to record Navy, the U.S. fleet's target practice. For a lieutenant, this is among the most responsible jobs and also sensitive jobs you can have, because during those periods, whoops, what am I doing? Mike, sorry. During this period, what was the most important thing the Navy had to be able to do that was secret? Was hit something. And so the fact was, this was something where Burke, in effect, came to master gunnery, came to fall in love with photography, among other things, but also was doing all sorts of other stuff to understand the broader aspects of the U.S. fleet. He also had completed a strategy and tactics correspondence course for the Naval War College, something that Admiral Nimitz noted was a rarity. On top of it, he witnessed, you will note that there were Marines here, the birth of the Fleet Marine Force. And in fact, Burke gave an oral history with the good people at the Marine Corps History Organization. They said, well, what did you do? You were witnessing the birth of the Fleet Marine Force. He says, yeah, I think I made one contribution. They asked him, what should we do after we get the Marines loaded? He said, why don't you make them circle? And so if you've seen amphibious operations, that's what the Marine boats did before World War II. They circled before they, in fact, then went in for an invasion. And so the Marine historian said, so you're actually Arleigh boat circling Burke as well. And then finally, on top of everything else, he was cleared for code-breaking intelligence because he was also the intelligence officer. These are foundations. You need to understand this was not just some, the fleet of guys who were floating their life away. This was a highly technical organization and prepared Burke. He then went on to the Bureau of Ordnance, as I said, that owned him, and as a lieutenant ran the entire ammunition section in the Bureau in the old Navy Department on Constitution Avenue, which is where the Vietnam Memorial is. Then in 1937, he made the decision to apply for service in destroyers. As he wrote me, and as this will, I think, will hit something for the Burke family, he decided he wanted to be a well-rounded officer as well as physically. There's a certain prominence of a certain thing that the Burke family has. Anyway, and so he decided he wanted to go, and he, because he was in the Bureau of Ordnance, ended up going, still getting this right, he went on to the USS Craven, a brand new destroyer building in Fall River, Massachusetts, took her to sea, learned an awful lot, and then 2 years later, in 1939, took command of the brand new destroyer Mugford with his crew, and immediately established an incredible record. 36 shots, 36 hits in short-range gunnery practice, never previously achieved. Won the Good Destroyer Gunnery Trophy of 1940, and E's in engineering, C's in communications, and all. He's a top-ranked destroyer commander. So what's the Navy do with him? They send him to Washington, a naval gun factory, because again, he is owned by the Bureau of Ordnance, and he is now in the gun factory in the Washington Navy Yard, and he is inspecting broadside and anti-aircraft gun mounts. And because the Navy is mobilizing and he is an expert, he literally moves back and forth across the country, inspecting in new companies that are now actually retooling to make U.S. Navy gun mounts. And he does this from 1940 until January 1943. He keeps applying for sea duty, and there's nobody to replace him. He's a technical expert until reserves start coming in to replace him. And so in early 43, he then goes to sea in command of Destroyer Division 43. On the way out, he stops in Boulder and visits his mother. These shots are actually taken on the front steps of the house. He can't get a flight out, so he becomes the troop commander on the SS President Monroe of the Marine Replacement Regiment that was going out in order to be able to have a job while he went out there. Took command of Des Div 43. You can tell he was pretty happy in Club des Slots on Guadalcanal, and then has his serves under Tip Merrill. His first flag captain is Larry Frost, and this is his first, this is a radar return from USS Denver, commanded by then Captain Carney, and he starts to impress people. The most important thing he does, though, is this. You need to understand that the U.S. Navy, in the first 2 years after World War II, was defeated at sea more times than it won anything. Yes, they won Midway, they took a draw, but pretty much won Coral Sea. But in the surface actions, they were getting beat, ships were getting sunk and all. Burke comes out after the Guadalcanal campaign is over, and he begins to rewrite surface doctrine. Burke believed in doctrine. He believed in how to, in fact, educate. He believed in communication, which is the really important part of all of this. He believed in making sure that seniors and subordinates could communicate with each other. They knew their jobs. They knew what to do, and they followed it. And so that's what he ended up doing, and he rewrote destroyer doctrine. In November 1943, he had the chance to put it all together in command of what was called Destroyer Squadron 23, 8 new Fletcher-class destroyers commanded by contemporaries that many of whom he knew. And he took them into combat in the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay and began to build probably the best combat force in the Solomons at that point. Okay, he also, in a fairly famous story, was walking around with Brute Reynolds, who was the skipper of Charles Osborne, and saw this symbol being painted on a torpedo tube. There's also a picture of Tojo as the target. And they decided this was a good title, and it was named for Little Beaver, put together by a Coloradan. A comic strip started in the late 30s by a guy named Fred Harmon, who had Red Ryder was a cowboy, and Little Beaver was a Jicarilla Apache. It was his sidekick, and in the movies, he was played by Robert Blake, who later went on to various kinds of acting fame and disfame. And so this helped to build the esprit of Desron 23 in these battles. They start writing songs about him. This was during the Cruiser Division 12, Less Noise on the Fantail extravaganza at Christmas 1943. He receives from Admiral Merrill the Navy Cross. Burke serves in command of Desron 23 for 5 months, only 5 months, but it's his most famous time in command. He wants to go command another destroyer squadron. The Bureau of Ordnance says, oh no. You're going to come back to Washington and run research and development. You've had your time at sea. You got a Navy Cross, and Merrill's giving you a Distinguished Service Medal, which is even more significant in that time. And so you've done your combat. And then what happens is Vice Admiral John S. McCain, Sr., recommends as an aviator, to Admiral King, also an aviator, that there needs to be an aviation-minded presence throughout the flag staffs in the Navy. So all surface admirals have to have an aviator chief of staff. And then they decide that has to be done vice versa. And so what happens is Burke gets told, okay, you're going to go to Carrier Division 3 to work for some guy named Mark Mitzer. And Mark Mitzer is a pioneer naval aviator, commissioned in 1910. He goes on, he joins Mitzer as chief of staff. Mitzer is very, very frosty to him, in part because Mitzer had Truman Heading, who was his own chief of staff, who was handpicked. But it turns out that after about 4 or 5 weeks, Burke and Mitzer begin to break the ice, get along. Burke is maneuvering the force, and it turns out that they become inseparable. Arleigh would still say, years after Mitzer passed away, that he was the most impressive naval officer he ever met, and Mitzer was among the key high command of the Navy. This is Nimitz, Spruance, Mitzer, and then Admiral Lee, who commanded the battleships. Burke also becomes a master of staff work, something that people don't necessarily recall. So he goes on and he does this, and he fights through the battles of Leyte Gulf, and before that, Philippine Sea. Goes ashore for a while, where he in fact gets fully briefed in on all the Navy intelligence back at the Pacific Fleet. There are any Pacific Fleet sailors, that's Makalapa. Goes up back on board USS Bunker Hill with Mitzer, and goes through Iwo Jima and Okinawa. It was during these campaigns that Burke is, in fact, basically, Burke and Mitzer are blown off the aircraft carrier Bunker Hill onto Enterprise, then are, in fact, from kamikaze attacks, blown off Enterprise. During the attack on Bunker Hill, Burke is awarded the Silver Star because of his actions saving lives and evacuating Mitzer from that conflagration that killed 300 sailors, and also took 30 members of the staff that he went down to try to rescue. By the end, in June of 1945, this is an exhausted staff on the USS Randolph, Mitzer, Burke, Jimmy Flatley, and Ace, and this strapping young man right here. Doesn't look like much of an officer, but he's a big guy. Looks like he could play football. Well, yes, he could. That is Byron R. Whizzer White, who later went on, who was a CU and NFL player, Rhodes Scholar, lawyer, later went on to be Deputy Attorney General and Supreme Court Justice. And for those who were at the Burke Park dedication, basically he died the next year, he came to the dedication of Arleigh Burke Park. The war ended. Burke goes back to the Bureau of Ordnance. He spends 6 months trying to run research and development, preserve things that had come up after the war, during the war, and then on top of it, he's one of the first people cleared for the atomic bomb. He is the alternate of the Navy advisor to the commander of the atomic bomb project. The only way we actually knew this, besides a piece of paper, was the fact that we have a travel authorization that he had to go to a place called Los Alamos. And we didn't know that because all we knew was he went to Santa Fe, and then what happened to him afterwards in 1945, we knew that that was the case. So he was one of the first guys cleared for that. Mitzer becomes commander of what's called the 8th Fleet, which will be the striking fleet for the Navy. Burke is pulled out of B Ward, again wearing the loops of an aide. He's re-promoted to Commodore, which he had been promoted to in November 44. They go with Forrest Sherman in 1946 to Europe, as far as Berlin, and to various other trouble spots, and start planning. Mitzer becomes commander of the Atlantic Fleet, and he stays with him, and they're also still trying to figure out what you do with the atomic bomb and how do you prevent the Russians from taking Europe. When Mitzer dies in February 47, Burke goes to the General Board of the Navy as a junior member. He's specifically requested by John Towers, the pioneer naval aviator. He's in among a bunch of folks like Randolph Pate, who becomes Commandant of the Marine Corps, Freddie Boone, who will be a 4-star admiral, Sock McMorris, who was Nimitz's chief of staff, Charles Mompson, the guy who invented the Mompson loan, and a couple of other great political military guys. He writes a long paper on the future of the Navy that comes to the attention of Secretary of the Navy Forrestal, who then decides that what he wants to do is pull Burke back to support him as Secretary of Defense. The Navy says, no, you won't, and sends him to sea in command at USS Huntington, where he makes his first overseas deployment his entire career, joining the Huntington in Malta in June of 1948 and taking her all the way to Trieste, this during one of the tensest times going, the Berlin blockade and the Berlin airlift. Burke thought he was going to war. And in fact, I was fortunate enough that Navy cryptologists knew this character, a guy named Hal Jocelyn, who in fact was a cryptologist who led the first surface, or not first, direct support elements, and the Navy Tributes let me interview him, and he told me the story of what they were doing trying to track Soviet signals on his trip up to Trieste, and also Jocelyn told me this story. Burke was getting ready for war, and he literally told Jocelyn what his job would be doing was to give him warning, and he finally said, if we are hit, I will be beaching the ship in Yugoslavia and fight to the last man, and then we'll get in the boats and the rafts, and we'll tow ourselves over to Italy. That was vintage Arleigh Burke, but something no one ever knew. And I was fortunate because Hal died at the age of 99. They then came down the east coast of Africa and then up the west coast of Latin America. This is Huntington in Cape Town, and this is a shot of Arleigh Burke, but of all things, anybody recognize this guy? No. Good shot. Juan Perón, cry for me, Argentina. Okay, he comes back and is immediately ordered to bring Huntington into Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, where in fact she's going to be decommissioned. And instead he says, pick your own relief from whatever captains are there and report to Washington. You're going to run something called the Organizational Research and Policy Division of the Office of the CNO. And this is where Arleigh, who was involved in this a bit as Chief of Staff to Mitzer when Mitzer ran the Atlantic Fleet, and also at the General Board, he gets heavily involved in all the battles over unification, the removal of the Navy as a separate cabinet department and submerging it in 1949, not 47, but 49 inside the Department of Defense and all. And then the battles over the USS United States versus the Air Force B-36 bomber, the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time with retired General Eisenhower, President of Columbia University helping to run this, the Navy's first proposal for carriers, and Admiral Arthur Radford, who had been Vice Chief of Naval Operations, using Burke to orchestrate the Navy testimony in front of the House Armed Services Committee in 1949 in what became known as the Admirals' Revolt. Well, Navy made some good arguments, but it didn't sit well with the Secretary of Navy, Francis Matthews, nor with the Secretary of Defense, Louis Johnson. They conspired and took Burke off the promotion list for Rear Admiral. He had previously been recommended by Mitzer twice and to do this, but Burke said, no, I'd rather get promoted in time. He was removed from the promotion list, but his classmate, President Truman, asked his classmate, his naval aide, Bob Dennison, because he'd been hearing the rumors, is there something wrong about this list? And Dennison explained, yes, sir, there is. And then on top of it, Forrest Sherman, who thought very well of Burke, who'd been Nimitz's planner, works on Matthews, and ultimately what happens is Truman convinces Matthews and Johnson. They reconvene the selection board, and Burke's name is now on the list, and it makes the front page of every newspaper in Washington, D.C. when the list is released. Burke works for the Research and Development Board for about 5 months, and then is ordered by Sherman to Korea. I do ask this question. Any Westpac sailors here? Okay. Yokosuka Officers Club. Recognize that portrait? It's the Arleigh Burke Officers Club. This is one of the things that Burke said when they named it for him. He said, I think I'm more proud of this than almost anything. It's the most appropriate thing you could do for me. So anyway, Burke goes to Naval Forces Far East. He's ordered there by Sherman. He is also still working under, Radford is commanding the Pacific Fleet. This is Turner Joy, who he's working with, and he spends his time planning essentially every major operation through the spring of 1951, starting with the Incheon landing and then the evacuation and all when the Chinese come in, the evacuation of Wonsan Harbor and all. He then goes to command the Cruiser Division 5. He becomes friends with former Japanese enemies, including Admiral Nomura, who had been the ambassador to the United States at the time of Pearl Harbor. They become very, very close friends. This is Burke on Los Angeles at the time, Yokosuka Harbor, in 1950. Burke also works with the intelligence folks to develop an intelligence watch on the coast of China, starting something we still worry about a great deal right now, with Eddie Layton, who had been Nimitz's intelligence officer, and then with Herman Kostler, something that we didn't know about, but we had this picture, and I once asked him, what is this? He said, oh, that's when Herman Kostler and I went up to La Perouse Strait to look at Soviet activity. What? And so we tracked it down, USS Tilefish, Kostler commanding the submarine division. He'd won a Navy Cross for sinking a Japanese aircraft carrier during World War II. Go to La Perouse Strait to worry about whether the Russians might be coming in to the Korean War. And so this is how Burke begins. He only has 48 hours on Tilefish, but begins to realize the value of submarines. He is then assigned to the Korean truce negotiations. I love this picture. This is a screensaver, one of my screensavers, as well as some pictures. This is Arleigh Burke not happy, okay, in the Korean truce negotiations. Lived in a tent and then moved on to Panmunjom, but lived in Kaesong. This is Burke with the negotiating team, who I just mentioned, and General Ridgway, who were involved, and General Paik Sung-myup, who later becomes the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for Korea. This begins the connections that Burke has to senior leaders. He finally goes back to, keep doing that, there we go. Finally goes to Washington as a Rear Admiral. He spends 2.5 years running strategic plans. There's a lot of good stories from that, but not enough time to tell them. He then goes and commands Cruiser Division 4, Cruiser Division 6 in the Atlantic Fleet. There's a question Gordon will ask me that will provide some interesting insights into Burke's mindset. He's fairly frustrated at this time. It's not a lot for the head of a cruiser division to do, and he's beginning to think, I'm not so sure about what I really want to do. And then he goes on to command the destroyers of the Atlantic Fleet as a 2-star. He's numbered 92 on the flag list. There are 5 former CNOs, 3 of which are fleet admirals, and then 2 former CNOs still on active duty. So there are only 88 guys really ahead of him who could become CNO. And Charles Thomas, who is the Secretary of the Navy, decides he will not reappoint Mick Carney, one of Arleigh's closest friends, as CNO. And because of that, they do a search. And Ned Beach, the famous author and submariner who wrote Run Silent, Run Deep, told me the story about how the Undersecretary of the Navy, he was Naval Aide to Eisenhower at the time, the Undersecretary of the Navy and the Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Air helped Thomas send out messages saying, who's the five most qualified people to become CNO? And what they end up doing is they get a list back of five names from the 4 and 3 stars. Arleigh Burke is not on the top of every list, but he's on every list. Burke is brought in May of 1955. He interviews with the Secretary of the Navy. He interviews then later with the Secretary of Defense. They take him to meet Eisenhower. They spend a significant amount of time with Eisenhower, who admonishes him as to joint responsibilities he's going to have. And Eisenhower will agree to having Burke leaped over all these senior admirals, the most junior man ever to made CNO. He is also, again sharing with Nimitz, the only naval officer made CNO who never served as a vice admiral. He went directly from Rear Admiral to 4-star Admiral. This is swearing in at the Naval Academy in August 17, 1955. For what it's worth, this is his vice chief, who's been the vice chief since 1951, Donald Wu Duncan, who came up with most of the planning. After submariner Francis Lowe came up with the idea of the Doolittle raid, it was Duncan who made it come together. So he had worked to make the Doolittle raid happen. He then commanded the Essex in World War II, and he's been a 4-star. So what's Burke going to do? He's junior. He was a captain, practically, when the man was made vice CNO, but certainly was an admiral. He keeps it on for an entire year. They become friends. Burke does not shake up the Navy. He comes in and changes the Navy. What did he do? Well, this is what he did. There'll be a test. But I'm not going to run it through, other than note that Burke accomplishes essentially this. Essentially puts into place the peacetime strategy of forward deployment. He preserves it with the fleets of forward, a wartime strategy of forward defense, with Polaris, an alternative nuclear strategy of finite deterrence, not just building nuclear weapons and controlling retaliations, and having a Navy crisis and living in war. The rest of this I'm going to tell you about. So what is one of the first things he does? He'd gone to sea on Nautilus when he was still in Deslant, and he's impressed. And so as a result, this is Rickover in 1954, already famous, and on the cover of Time magazine. He makes the decision early on in the fall of '55 that all U.S. submarines from here on will be nuclear, and it will be based on this streamlined Albacore hull. He begins building nuclear-powered surface ships, initially the cruiser Long Beach, later Enterprise, and then finally the guided missile cruiser, but really a destroyer leader in the beginning, USS Bainbridge. He actually has a hand in the personal design of USS Long Beach and the characteristics of the ship. He backs the Forrestal-class carriers, of which they continue to build. They've already got Forrestal and Saratoga, but now they also then add Ranger and Independence and the Kitty Hawk and the Constellation, all during his tour as C&O. He also starts building the Charles F. Adams class of guided missile destroyers. He approves in December 1955 the Marine Corps concept of vertical envelopment with helicopters as the future of amphibious warfare. And in 1957, all of this in his first period as first tour as C&O, he in fact approves fast combat support ships to help remake Navy logistics at sea. All of this in first 2 years. Why? Because every C&O before that had been fired. And because every C&O before that had either fired or in the case of Forrest Sherman died, they figured he wasn't going to be around very long. He was so junior. And instead, Eisenhower decides to reappoint him. Burke also makes the decisions that will make the F-4 Phantom the prime Navy fleet fighter, the A-6 Intruder, and then, going back to his time on Arizona, he in fact supports command and control with the Navy Tactical Data System, which in effect has been upgraded, Link 16 now and all. And he's also backing even PT boats and buys a couple of PT boats for potential inshore warfare. This is a great quote. Gordon and I share this because I first met Gordon because I was writing history of long-range planning in the Navy, and Gordon was my point of contact inside the Navy who gave me an office and a desk. Anyway, this is something when I started writing it, I mentioned to Burke what I was doing. He gave me this wonderful comment. There's no trick to Navy long-range planning, Dave. You get the Navy ready to fight today, and then you keep it ready to fight every day thereafter. Okay, and you start thinking about this. Burke was great. He could come up with great, pithy lines, both about people and about challenges. And this is as good an example of what he could do with words that showed the clarity of his thinking and the complexity of his thinking. Because we then got into this long discussion about, wait a minute, what do you mean? And he keeps looking at me, saying, that's right. That's right. As you go through this and you realize he's challenging you by having given you this kind of thinking. This is what he was like. He used to write, before emails, he used to write memos. And we have half a safe, 5-drawer safe, full of these memos that then you have to, some of them are really important. You got to figure out where it came from. Besides all the memos for the record, for every meeting he attended and all of that, which has also been the challenge of this stuff. Oops, wrong one. There we go. He's a member of the Joint Chiefs. And this is a shot of the Chiefs in Puerto Rico for a meeting in 1956, and then the later Joint Chiefs. This is Radford as chairman, Max Taylor as Chief of Staff of the Army, Nathan Twining, and remember Randolph Pate? That's Randolph Pate, Commandant of Marines. Then by 1960, you got Nathan Twining as chairman, Air Force officer, Tommy White as Chief of Staff of the Air Force, Medal of Honor recipient David Shoup as Commandant of the Marine Corps, and Lyman Lenmister and later chairman. So he has to work with a lot of senior officers from different services, many of which, particularly the Air Force, would do respect and friendship to the Air Force that Burke would fight with. He also went through many, many international crises, a lot of which we don't know. There's not a lot of time to explain these, but in 1956, Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal. The British and French and Israelis come together to try to take it back. Eisenhower decides that he doesn't like this, and Burke orders the Sixth Fleet to the Eastern Mediterranean, commanded by Charles R. Cat Brown. When Brown brings the Sixth Fleet to the Eastern Mediterranean, Burke says, be prepared for immediate hostilities. Brown radios back, am prepared for immediate hostilities. Which side am I on? Burke radios back, if American citizens are in danger, protect them, take no guff from anyone. And it's also the first time we actually display the A3D Sky Warrior in a ready position when we send the USS Forrestal and the USS Franklin D. Roosevelt into the Atlantic Fleet because Khrushchev is threatening to intervene. And so we actually go to a wartime footing during this time. In 1958, we land troops in Lebanon, Admiral James L. Holloway Jr. We also have in 1958 a crisis in Taiwan that looks like potential nuclear war with China until Eisenhower says, I don't want you to use nuclear weapons. Burke classmate Don Felt is involved in that. And then amazingly enough, there's also in 58, 59, and onward, crises over Berlin. This is with Clarence Ekstrom, the commander of the Sixth Fleet. And Burke comes up with planning to, in fact, do a maritime response to Russian efforts to blockade Berlin. This carries on, becomes part of then top secret NATO planning. All of this is now happily declassified. And it stays. I was involved in planning for, we did a major exercise in 1989. And I was told to come out as a lieutenant and evaluate the exercise, the war plans, and the intelligence for the commander of the Pacific Fleet, David Jeremiah. I put together an 18-page paper. And the problem was I was saying, look, guys, you're thinking the Russians are going to implement this incredible war plan, but the fact is the Soviet Empire is dying, and it's probably not likely what's going to happen. This is just 2 months before the Berlin Wall came down. And the planner I was working for says, yeah, David, but we do think about, we did have a plan for limited operations, but you can't see that. It's still, compartmented. I said, you mean the stuff for Berlin? He said, how the hell did you know about that? Well, the early stuff is open. Well, we now know, thanks to a German colonel, we're not sure he was East or West, wrote a chapter, and he actually provided a code name, Sea Spray, for the Pacific Fleet planning that lasted until the end of the Cold War. That was Burke's work. So he continued to have an influence even on planning all the way to the end of the Cold War, and we only have now, been able to find that out and talk about it. Okay. This is also in the exhibit at the museum, but it's really worth it. The Navy launches a satellite, and President Eisenhower sends him a bottle of Chivas Regal. His PAO, Public Affairs Officer, Buck Wilhide, drafts a letter and joking letter, but doesn't expect Burke to send it. When he comes back to pick it up, in horror, he finds out that Burke had signed it. And if you work your way through it, just get to the last paragraph. Thanks again for the bug juice. Best damn bourbon I ever had. Sure is good stuff, just like my pappy used to make. Okay, and so forth. So, it's worth it to actually spend some time on this, and as I said, it's there. And you would think this might cause a problem, because after all, Burke had opposed increased in unification that Eisenhower sponsored, National Security Act amendments and various other things. And Burke was coming up for, wanted to retire. Well, this is what I wrote. And so, a couple of months later, he is, I'll show the picture later, he is reappointed as CNO for the third term, unprecedented. Burke's greatest contribution is the Fleet Ballistic Missile and Submarine. He appoints Red Rayburn to run what became known as the Polaris program, and in 5 years' time, they take the Polaris missile from concept to sea, so that by 1960, George Washington goes on her first patrol, followed by Patrick Henry. And other boats are actually commissioned before she leaves. This is a signature of the commanding officer, Reuben Woodall, Steve's daddy, who was the skipper of Robert E. Lee at the time. And so it's a remarkable accomplishment that stays with us. Again, he's reappointed to a third term, and is still enjoying it. Always would have been really happy to go home. That's Fred Korth in the upper left, and then Burke with the chiefs, namely Pate and White. And then this is the old Pentagon. I love this picture because it's not there anymore. It doesn't look anything like this because of what they redid. And then Burke in 1960 at the Naval Academy at a midshipman rally before an Army-Navy game. Burke has continuing fights with the Air Force. They take too long to get into. Burke loses this one in a number of ways as to what happens. Tommy Power, head of SAC, wins this in terms of the creation of war plans. But then Burke is also doing other things. And this is a great, this is designed to sort of show the little things that Burke did that people don't think are important, and yet they are. Okay, in 1956, he proposes a naval command course. The Navy says, let's put it at the postgraduate school for foreign officers. He says, no, I want it at Newport. This command force is still there. We still bring Navy leadership, juniors and seniors, to this course, and we've had future Navy leaders, the heads of foreign navies, you know, dozens and dozens, and a couple, thanks to coups, of even heads of country have been graduates of the Naval Command Course and all. He also, in 1959-1960, starts a strategic islands project looking at the Indian Ocean, knowing that the Russians are interested, and ultimately it creates the foundation for the U.S. Navy to encourage the British not to give independence to Diego Garcia when they give the Maldives independence. Still something controversial, but the base at Diego Garcia goes back to Burke's influence. This is Joshua Goldberg, Navy chaplain, Navy Reserve chaplain. First Jewish Navy chaplain, in fact, World War II. Joshua Goldberg was born in Russia, was in the Russian Army during World War I. This is an important background. Who then migrates, he deserts from the Russian Army and is under a death sentence, but goes to Palestine, where he, in fact, as a very young man, is involved with intermediate and with various athletics. And he's a legend in what becomes Israel, in Israeli athletics. He joins the Navy Reserve at the start of World War II, rises ultimately to captain. He is the chaplain of the 3rd Naval District in New York. One day, phone rings at his house. Mrs. Goldberg answers the phone. Chief of Naval Operations wants to talk to you. And it turns out, can you be here tomorrow? I need to talk to you. Goldberg goes down. And the story is amazing because Goldberg happily left a long history. But there was a letter that introduces Goldberg to the commander of the 6th Fleet. He'll explain what he's doing. And so, because the Naval Intelligence Officer's done a lot of work with senior leaders, I asked them in Naval Intelligence, what's this about? No idea. What happened? Goldberg went in full dress to Israel on the 6th Fleet's flagship and met with the Israeli government to establish a naval attaché program in Tel Aviv. Ask me about this, Howard Hulsher. This is a great story about how Howard Hulsher won a bet with Arleigh Burke, but I don't want to go through this now. Burke is the architect of American submarine reconnaissance. A few years ago, we couldn't talk about this at all, but I got the submariners. I also run the Submarine League's Naval History Seminar, so I'm trusted by submariners and can speak submarine. And so this is a memo, but this is where U.S. submarines were during the Cold War. And this is, Burke is the guy who sends Nautilus to the North Pole, where she receives a unique presidential unit citation, and he also sends Triton around the world submerged. And so this is William R. Anderson with Burke at the National Press Club, and Ned Beach with Burke off to the side and Rick over on the other side, when Ned, who was Eisenhower's naval aide. So this was public stuff. But on top of it, even before that, this was top secret at the time. This is Jim Calvert asks Burke, he had taken skate to the North Pole in 1958. And he said, so what's your charge to us? And he said, these are his words. This is from transcripts. So these are his exact words to these captains who he met with for more than an hour. Develop the areas around Russia, know us to follow the Russian submarines so that we know what we have got. If they know it that we're following, it doesn't matter. That's not quite true, and it never was. But how many of you ever saw the movie Hunt for Red October? Hello? And then the third is trading us on how to fight them. Okay. He also develops a special relationships with the Brits. This was declassified. I'm only in here, don't have to read it, but he establishes this relationship, and it's in here just to prove it's declassified, because not only was it declassified for me by O&I, but it was published by the British, who did a semi-official history of the British submarine force. And then on top of it, he also works it out with, should have a better picture of him, but this is in action. This is Admiral Jerry Wright, who was the commander of the Atlantic Fleet. He writes to Wright and he says, you know, we ought to have a prize for the first Navy units that are able to surface a Soviet submarine. And so what happens is the USS Grenadier, commanded by Ted Davis here, along with Navy Neptune aircraft, end up surfacing, and this is stuff that is a result of it, a Russian submarine that actually has missile tubes in it. This is Jimmy Thatch, the Navy ace, who in fact was put in charge of ASW, and these are the Greenland Ice and UK Gap, and the start of the undersea surveillance system that became a revolutionary thing for doing sound detection of Soviet submarines. Anyway, this is Ted Davis wearing what was called the Arleigh Medal, A-R-L-I-E, that was made for him by the submarine division. But more importantly, this is the last bottle of a case of Jack Daniels that was the prize that was awarded the USS Grenadier. And this is still sitting, I think Ted Davis has passed on, but this was sitting as of a decade ago in Ted Davis's office, courtesy of Arleigh Burke and Jerry Wright. In addition, he does a lot of work in signals intelligence, but nobody ever knew it because it was secret. Anybody know what NSA stands for? National Security Agency? Well, for the longest time, it's called no such agency, okay? And for a long time, NSA used to be at Arlington Hall in Virginia, then moved to Fort Meade, Maryland, and this gent, then a lieutenant, later a rear admiral, Max Showers, who I counted as a very close friend, the last survivor of Nimitz's codebreakers, Station Hypo. Max Showers ran a part of the Office of the CNO that was part of NSA at Arlington Hall, and then became the Navy Field Operational Intelligence Office. The Navy helped build these massive elephant cages. This is at Rota, Spain. They also put together these things. This is in Japan, and then built buildings, and then did special electronic search flights around the Soviet Union. All of this was stuff that Burke never talked about, but there were memoranda and things like that that show. And also, as Mac told me, he said Burke was one of the few line officers who was cleared for special intelligence from World War II onward. So another secret side of Burke. On top of it, Burke also took the Navy into space. He was a space visionary. And so, among other things, most people think that the Air Force Corona and CIA Corona satellite is the first satellite. It's an imagery satellite taking pictures. In fact, the first American electronic satellite is the GRAB. Stood for Galactic Radiation and Background, but in fact was an electronic intelligence satellite that detected Soviet emissions that initially helped war planning for nuclear war, but then was followed by POPI that then established the means by which the Navy would in fact go and do tracking of ships, do maritime ELINT as it was called. This is a memo from Burke right after this was approved as a classified program, but nobody knew this. I didn't know this because I had a friend who had this until they finally declassified it because it was so sensitive, that the fact was that this was a memo from Burke saying, I want people on Navy staffs, 1959, who know space. And this is what started what the Navy now calls the space cadre. And then finally, Burke was also cleared for the U-2 starting in 1955-56. And then there is this amazing memo that for some people don't have a heart attack. This is the memorandum signed by Dwight Eisenhower to the senior leadership with other people signing in as being cleared for it that establishes what's known as the talent keyhole compartment. And for many of you who know TK or talent keyhole, oh God, no, this is on the Eisenhower Library website. It is fully declassified. And interestingly enough, if you work your way down, note these initials. There's Arleigh, okay? He is in fact involved at the cutting edge of all of this. Kennedy administration comes in, Burke has had enough, but he's still fighting. He hates Castro. He hates what Castro did. He really liked the Cuban Navy. He wasn't crazy about Batista, but he really liked the Cuban Navy. And the problem is that the CIA did not do a particularly good job. Alan Dulles, the director, and Richard Bissell, who was director of plans, who helped organize the invasion of the Bay of Pigs, we're talking about creating a guerrilla force. They instead tried a regular invasion. There were many, many, many things wrong with it. Burke used to say, there are two things I will never comment about publicly. One is women and the other is the Bay of Pigs. One is that one I know too much about and one I know too little. So, anyway, but I know he talked to Bobby because Bobby told me about how distressed he was. Bay of Pigs was a disaster. Burke really argued with Kennedy about intervening, and Kennedy would not do that. And Burke by then said, I'm done. And that as a result, he was ready to retire. But in the midst of this, he was appointed to a committee to investigate the Bay of Pigs. This is a great picture. There he is, John F. Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor. This is watching Alan Shepard go up 60 years ago. Okay? He's working with Maxwell Taylor again to, in fact, investigate the Bay of Pigs. And in the meantime, Kennedy puts out a requirement for unconventional warfare. Burke puts out a memo saying he'd already started an unconventional warfare division in the office of the CNO that he was working with CIA on. And one way we could prove that was done, and then I could get it out from the Navy, was CIA posted the letter on their website. So this has been the story of my life. Wallace Beakley, who'd been 7th Fleet Commander's Deputy CNO for Operations and Readiness, he puts together a memo with William Gentner about what these guys ought to be doing and what they ought to be called. They propose a name, Sea, Air, Land. And what this is, it's the origins, and Burke is the guy who proves it, it's the origins of the SEALs. And in fact, in at least one program I saw on the History Channel, the SEALs have called Burke Papa SEAL. So he's a father of space cadre, he started submarine reconnaissance, and he's Papa SEAL, besides, and started Polaris, besides everything else. Burke retires August 1st, 1961 at the Naval Academy. Kennedy gives him a Distinguished Service Medal. For that, the Navy establishes the Arleigh Burke Fleet Trophy. Burke continues his association with the Navy as an informal advisor to CNOs. So what you have here, this is his immediate successor, George Anderson. Anderson gets fired, McDonald replaces him. This is Burke saying to Dave McDonald, I hope you have your back armor strapped on for people who stab you in the back. Anderson, Denfeld, Stark from Pearl Harbor, Carney, Tom Moore, Radford Chairman, and Burke. And then this is 1986, Holloway, Trost. These are all the former CNOs, all the way up to right before Burke passed away with Frank Kelso in 1994. They retired to a house in Bethesda, Maryland, and lived there for more than 20 some odd years at 6 Fenway Drive in Bethesda. Burke enjoys gardening, and he likes dogwood trees. He puts dogwood trees in front of the Naval Observatory, which is still there. He helps to found the Center for Strategic and National Studies, which is still there. And then in January 1977, Gerald Ford breaks tradition, and Arleigh Burke is the first career naval officer, Zumwalt is the only other one, to be awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in January 1977. They moved to the Virginian in the late 1980s, and Burke is still as active as he possibly can until eventually it all catches up to him, and he dies of congestive heart failure on New Year's Day, 1996. I was called immediately, ended up going down to Washington, was getting phone calls constantly from Joe Sestak, later an admiral, who was writing the eulogy. I also spent the night before the funeral with Vice Admiral Joe Metcalf, working on his eulogy. And with Mike, I'm sorry. I also spent, I helped Joe Sestak write Clinton's speech. I helped Admiral Joe Metcalf write the eulogy that he gave at the Naval Academy and the Naval Institute published. And if you look carefully, you will find in this row up there, that's me and my bride there. This is Patrick Ward, who had helped to save the Burkes. He was an optometrist, Navy optometrist with Burke and Clinton. And then this is, Burke designed this himself. And for the longest time, people thought he was dead because this was at the Naval Academy, but it didn't have his death date on it, much less Bobby's. And as Gordon noted, I was a pallbearer at Mrs. Burke's funeral, staring across the gravesite right at the Chief of Naval Operations, Jay Johnson. Anyway, so Burke's legacy, the SEALs, a Navy that can fight at night, Navy with sophisticated logistics, big deck amphibs, Polaris, moving on to Trident, and now the Columbia class. International support, this is a international task force to include the French carrier and an Italian carrier. Command and control to control all of this. A Navy that can still does go in the Arctic, Office of Naval Intelligence. And then finally, this on the right, on the left is my favorite. This helped to inspire me so that I didn't just read American history. I don't know if I helped make it, but I at least did get involved. This came up after 9/11. And so that's Burke's story. So I took a bit of a length of time, I'm sorry, but I hope you found this of interest. Thank you.
you stay and take some questions?
Absolutely.
Thank you, David. Regrettably, our time has expired, but David has very kindly agreed to stay after we break to take questions and answers on a one-on-one basis. So if you have a question, I would encourage you to come up and engage Dr. Rosenberg. Thank you all for joining us this morning. We invite everyone to visit the Broomfield Veterans Museum to see the special exhibit honoring Adm Burke. The Burke exhibit will run through mid-September. The museum is open Tuesdays from 10 a.m. until 2 p.m. and on Saturdays from 9 until... My mistake. The museum is open every Thursday from 10 a.m. until 2 p.m. and on Saturdays from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. Indeed, it is open today as we speak. If you would like to segue over to the museum when we break and see the Adm Arleigh A Burke exhibit. Many of us were there last night. It's a wonderful exhibit and definitely worth your time. That completes this morning's program. And again, if you have questions for Dr. Rosenberg, he'll be available here. There is still coffee in the back of the room. Thank you for coming this morning. I hope you enjoyed the program.